Does Alexey Navalny's death mark the death knell for Russian opposition? After weeks reported missing while serving his sentence in an Arctic Circle prison, Russian officials finally confirmed Navalny was dead on Friday. Many call it another murder in a long list of targeted Putin critics. But could his passing also prove a near final blow to Kremlin opposition? I'm Andrij Dobriansky, and today's newsmaker is Alexey Navalny. Many analysts and Alexey Navalny himself warned that he might be killed by agents of the Kremlin, especially while serving a 19-year sentence in a remote penal colony. But Navalny had long told his supporters that if he dies, they will need to continue fighting for democracy in Russia, using the infrastructure he built through his anti-corruption foundation. He was confident they could do so, with or without his leadership. But now, after Anna Politkovskaya, Alexander Litvinenko, and Sergey Magnitsky, just to name a few, will Russians continue to have the courage to oppose an ever more powerful Vladimir Putin? Here's a look.
Russia's opposition leader, Alexey Navalny, once Putin's most significant political challenger, has met a sudden end in prison, casting a long shadow over the country's political landscape. Once a lawyer, Navalny morphed into a beacon of hope for many citizens, advocating for a Russia free from corruption. His death, almost a month before the presidential election, leaves a void which will not be easily filled. Russia claims the 47-year-old died of natural causes, but not everyone is convinced.
Но если это правда.
I want Putin and all of his entourage, Putin's friends and his government to know that they will be held accountable for what they have done to our country, to my family and to my husband, and that they will come very soon. And I want to call on the entire global community, everyone in this room and people around the world, that we come together to unite and defeat this evil, defeat the horrific regime that is now in Russia.
Though Navalny and his supporters expected he would die behind bars, few thought it would be so soon.
You know, like millions of people around the world, I'm literally both not surprised and outraged by the news. Reported death of Alexey Navalny. He bravely stood up to the corruption, the violence, and all the bad things that the Putin government was doing. In response, Putin had him poisoned, he had him arrested, even imprisoned. He was a powerful voice for the truth, which is kind of amazing when you think about it. Russian authorities are going to tell their own story. But make no mistake, Putin is responsible for Navalny's death. Putin is responsible.
From Biden's condemnation to Macron's homage to Navalny's courage, the international community is united in criticism of a regime they accuse of silencing a vital voice for democracy.
The news of Alexei Navalny's death is horrible. But it also shows that Putin fears nothing more than the dissent from his own people. Putin and his friends fear nothing more than people that stand up, that speak up, that fight for freedom, and that fight against corruption like Alexei Navalny did it.
Navalny's supporters across the globe have rallied to honour his legacy, but the Kremlin remains unmoved. Putin has been silent ahead of the Russian election, which could further entrench his rule. Navalny's demise is not just the loss of a political figure. Some see it as a stark reminder of the perils faced by those who dare to dissent.
Today, the world has lost a symbol of freedom. We lost a symbol of another Russia. Alexei Navalny gave his life to transform his country, to bring democracy.
While the world reflects on his legacy, the fight for freedom and justice continues, inspired by Navalny's undying spirit.
So, is a bright future possible, or has Navalny's death shown Russia is destined to have a government with no opposition? Joining me now to debate that are from New York, Andrij Dobriansky, the communications director for the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America. From Moscow, political science professor at the Moscow State University of International Relations and former member of the Russian parliament, Sergey Markov. And in Vilnius, a witness in Alexey Navalny's trial and head of the Political Prisoners Support Program at Memorial Human Rights Center, Sergey Davidis. Thanks all so much for being with me. Sergey, you were closest to Alexey Navalny, so I'll begin with you. I don't think anyone that knew him was necessarily surprised that he passed while in prison, but how likely are we to ever know how he actually died, and if anyone would ever be held accountable?
For sure, we do not know the details of his death, but anyway, it can be and should be and must be considered as a murder, as assassination, because even if there were no exact order to kill him this day, actively kill him this day, his death was a result of unlawful imprisonment, of tortures he was subjected, deprivation of sleep, deprivation of food, and so on, and of the poisoning, which was organized by Putin's order 4 years ago. So anyway, his death, even if there was no special order to kill him now, was is responsibility of Russian authority and Putin's personally, and is assassination.
Right. So it was, what you're saying is it was a cumulative, whether or not there was an actual act of direct murder involved in his final days. But still, right. Does it upset you, though, still, that the family has not received his body, that there has been no other independent examination or autopsy allowed?
We, like UN officials, like foreign leaders, demand to have such investigation organized, and for sure, Alexei's body should be given to his family. And the fact that Russian authorities decline these demands somehow prove that they have what to conceal. But we continue to demand it.
Okay. Andrij, you know, in one interview, Alexey Navalny actually said, if they decide to kill me, he was saying this to his organization and to his supporters, if they decide to kill me, that means we're incredibly strong. Do you think that's true? Did authorities truly fear his movement?
The authorities made sure that he died at the specific moment that he died and announced it, I believe, 2 minutes after the official record of his death was processed for the purpose of messaging. It really doesn't matter the actual mechanisms of death. You know, we should be talking about Anna Politkovskaya. We should be talking even about Galina Starovoytova. All these people who have been murdered in Russia, or the people like Alexander Litvinenko, who was poisoned outside of Russia, all people poisoned simply for putting out the message that Russia can do things with impunity. And in terms of returning the body, this is just another way for the Russian government to thumb its nose at the world, at the family, and says, we're going to do whatever we want, and we will release the body whether we want to or not on our own timeline. This is not about justice. This is about demonstrating that this is an unjust regime that needs to be destroyed.
Sergey, I'll just ask you very simply, what do you make of his death? And do you believe the state bears the responsibility here?
I think I knew Alexei Navalny personally. I met him many times. He was very smart, very educated, very modern style politician with big ambitions and big possibility for the future. And he really could be the leader of some kind of new opposition, more pro-Western, pro-democratic. The tragedy of Alexei Navalny that he appeared to be a leader of pro-Western, pro-American opposition in the situation when America was becoming, moving from the partner, even difficult partner of Russia, to the clear enemy of Russia, who support clear fascist regime on Ukraine against Russia.
Sergey, quickly,
And,
I didn't ask you about his politics, though. I was asking about whether you think the state is responsible for his death now.
Yeah. And I think that United States of America and Ukrainian intelligence service responsible mostly for his death. It's one version. Another version, that's a cruelty of low-level officers who make quite bad conditions for him, because he spent 300 days in the as punishment. It's upper polar circle. It's very bad conditions for the any health. So these two major versions.
Okay, but what you just said describes why the state could be held responsible. They put him in those miserable conditions. You also said earlier that you thought his sentence was pretty excessive for what the crime that he was actually initially convicted of. So should someone be held responsible in Russia, whether or not you think he's the agent of Ukraine or the United States or the EU? This was done on your state territory.
Yes, state territory. We know that Ukrainian neo-fascist regime organized a lot of terrorist attacks on the Russian state territory. And here it's one of the possibilities should be a clear investigation. And the time of the death of Alexey Navalny, very useful for the enemies of Vladimir Putin, because this is just 1 month before the presidential elections. And we know that United States of America and European countries, they want to deny legitimacy of the new re-election of Vladimir Putin on the next term. They want to say, look, possibly Vladimir Putin was bad president of Russia previous time, but from this election, Vladimir Putin even not legal president. Not even bad president, but just not legal president at all. And the death of Alexei Navalny helps them very much in their conducting such a policy. That's why the main question about any events, who is mostly beneficial from this death? It's absolutely clear that mostly beneficial from this death, those who deny legitimacy of the new term of the presidency of Vladimir Putin. It means Joe Biden, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, leaders of European Union, and leaders of the Ukrainian neo-fascist regime.
Sergey, is there any Sergey Davidis, is there any legitimacy to what Sergey Markov is saying, and that the actual winners in this are Joe Biden, EU leadership, or is this strictly about Putin, you think, eliminating any opposition to his regime?
I think it's absolute attempts to wash white Putin's regime. We see that Putin tried to kill Alexei Navalny with his poisoners. Then he arrested him, and his courts have sentenced him to, after many trials, for 19 years of deprivation of liberty. He was sent to the most remote prison in the country. He has spent 300 days in a row in punishment cells. He did not receive medical treatment he needed, and so on. And Putin, it's rather obvious, even was afraid to mention his name, speaking about him. He was a main enemy of Putin's regime, and he was prosecuted because of that. And his death is natural consequence and the action in the row of their previous actions. There are no doubts that it's responsibility of Putin and his regime.
Andrij, I mean, you mentioned as well, as I did at the introduction of this program, Alexander Litvinenko, Anna Politkovskaya. With this death, is it bigger than those? Is this the last of the Russian opposition? I mean, Do people understand now, with the message that you think the Kremlin is sending, that you have to be willing to die in a pretty horrific way if you want to criticize the Kremlin right now?
I'm going to split those up into two things. One, you mentioned the other people who were poisoned, Alexander Litvinenko, Anna Politkovskaya. But, you know, those are two names that are known, including Alexander Navalny, Alexey Navalny, a person who had an Oscar-winning film about him. What we don't talk about is Yelena Koschenko, a journalist who was poisoned in Munich, who's not dead yet, but all these events and all these people who are tortured by Russia, including over 26 journalists who are being held captive from Ukraine, including Evan Gershkovich. We're talking about scores and scores of people, over 250,000 Russian citizens who were sent to their death to attack Ukraine and died that way. This is a regime that does not care about people. And we are talking about Alexei Navalny, and he does get attention. But what we don't talk about enough is all those other people who don't merit international news stories about them.
But Russians know who they are.
Yeah.
Russians know who they are. And
yeah.
Again, I was asking about the chilling example. And I shouldn't have said just, you know, do they have to be willing to die? Do they have to be willing to maybe survive a poisoning of, you know, weapons grade style or torture in a miserable penal colony at the Arctic Circle? Is that what they're up against if they just dare criticize now?
Absolutely, and that goes to the second part of your question: where is this the end of it in terms of the Russian movement against the government? Because we saw around the time of or after Anna Politkovskaya's death, the movement against the Russian government. That the largest protests we have had within the last decade were the Bolotnaya Square protests, which happened all over the Russian Federation, and that was over a decade ago. Since that time, we don't have anything even approaching 50,000 people gathering. It just doesn't happen anymore, and that's because Boris Nemtsov was gunned down. That's because Alexei Navalny was imprisoned and poisoned and now killed. That's because Garry Kasparov can't, afford to be in Russia anymore. It's because Khodorkovsky was arrested and then had to repent publicly. The entire protest movement has been systematically eliminated, not just at this top level of these names I mentioned, but on the local level. Local leaders have been eliminated. People who are, decent leaders at the local level have been targeted by the Russian regime, and we never hear about them anymore because of the control of the Russian Federation.
Sergey, does it disturb you, especially someone who sat in parliament as what is supposed to be part of a representative parliamentary system, that there is no opposition? You even have an election coming up, and one of the last true opposition members on the ballot has now been eliminated. What do you think parliamentarians actually stand for in that parliament now, if there is no opposition?
There are in Russia, but first of all, I want to say that we should think about a list of the numerous opponents to the Kiev neo-fascist regime who have been killed in Ukraine. Alexey Buzina, Oleg Kalashnikov, Mikhail Chechetov. There are a huge number of them. And this is they have been publicly killed by Ukrainian government. And nobody have been punished of this. And against this regime exactly, majority of the Russian opposition unite. Russian opposition
So if
exists,
they do it, you can do it too?
Yeah, Russian opposition exists, but this opposition to the economic course of Vladimir Putin, as for example, Communist Party, they're very much against the economic policy of Vladimir Putin. Same time, just Russia coalition, they some kind of socialists, they also very much criticize economic policy of Vladimir Putin. But about the fighting against fascism, everybody united. No opposition in Russia about this. About resistance to the American imperialism, who wants to dominate in every country, who want to grab in every country, and who destroy Iraq, who destroy Vietnam, who destroy Afghanistan.
Okay, I
destroy
understand
Syria.
your
On
point,
this issue,
Sergey,
no
coming from
opposition.
your perspective. Let me ask you this then, Sergey. You had said before that Alexey Navalny was not nearly as popular as the West kind of portrayed him to be within Russia. So tell me honestly, do Russians care about what Navalny exposed concerning corruption, the nepotism, the brash spending, or is that just what's expected of their leaders and it's not of much interest to the electorate in Russia?
You ask me, yes?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, Russians very much care about this anti-corruption investigation of Alexei Navalny. And they support this investigation, and they have been making pressure on Russian authorities that those people should be punished. But Russians nevertheless understand that the investigator, agent of the enemies of Russia, and that's why should be no respect to those investigators, because their goal not to make Russian better, to decrease corruption, but their goal to make Russia much more bad, to move Russia to this condition on which Ukraine now, when thousands of people have been killed by repressive neo-fascist regime, when Russian language prohibited. Do you really believe that Russians in Russia want that Russian language should be prohibited? No. That's why I see anti-corruption, these documents, points have been supported by most of the Russia, but Alexei Navalny has been supported only before he denied to support Crimea joining Russia. But after Alexei Navalny decided to support pro-American repressive Russophobic regime in Ukraine, he killed himself as political leader.
Okay. Sergey Davidis, let me ask you this, because as we speak of, the actions of foreign powers that Russia thinks are nothing short of nefarious in every single case, Alexei Navalny supporters are looking toward the outside, for support for his cause. So part of the response has been the EU actually seeking further sanctions now for what has happened to Alexei Navalny. What do you make of that? Is that the appropriate response? Does it help your cause, or does it actually just embolden Putin? Because we've seen how he's been able to maneuver around sanctions anyway, and the Russian economy is doing just fine, and it actually proves his strength even more so to his supporters.
I don't think that we should speak about some sufficient new sanctions imposed because of Alexei's death. For sure, it's important to respond, but I think the most part of sanctions EU could afford has been already imposed. It's important, though, that after this tragedy, some conclusions are made, and Western leaders become more principled and increase pressure on Putin's regime, provide more support to Ukraine, fighting against war of aggression, and it would be best response to this unhuman action.
Okay. I mean, Andrij, I imagine you agree that Western pressure helps in certain ways. The sanctions, they might have failed in certain respects, but they're better than nothing. But I have to look forward a little bit, because Donald Trump is coming back on the U.S. political scene in particular. There are many who think he might even win the next election. He has refused to comment even on this at all. How much do you worry that that could be the direction the U.S. is going in, from your perspective, especially when it comes to responding to a death like this?
You probably haven't seen as much activity online propagating on American politicians and their comments to their statements from Russian bots, from people who are supporting Russia's state killing of Navalny in a way that we're seeing now, especially with the failure of the aid bill to Ukraine. When the Senate passed a bill in early February, almost all senators who voted in favor of that legislation to arm Ukraine were just bombarded with messages from so-called Americans. Again, we don't know if these are real people, but commentating that we shouldn't be doing this, that Russia, we shouldn't be at war with Russia. So obviously, the Russian regime has picked up their propaganda now, thinking in lieu or anticipating something happening with the return of President Trump. I think we're hearing that from senators like J.D. Vance, who traveled all the way to Munich just to not speak with President Zelensky. Okay. And we do know that the sanction regime is too porous. We do need to do something like naming Russia a state sponsor of terror.
Okay. Sergey Markov, 30 seconds. What would that mean to Russia, naming Russia a state sponsor of terror? Or if not, just increasing sanctions? Does Russia care?
No, Russia don't care. They are our enemies. They want to kill off us. They want to destroy us. They use terroristic regime which they created in part of the Russia, which called Ukraine.
Okay, Sergey Markov, that will have to be the final word. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists, as always, so much for being with us on this edition of The Newsmakers. And our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrij Dobriansky. We'll see you next time.